some information as soon as possible about that from the journal. And well, I think that everyone here has agreed that music has the power to get people together. But how literally should we take these common sense statements? So in this work, we try to see if an interaction, a musical interaction, can modulate the peripersonal space of the musicians involved in it, two musicians. But what is peripersonal space? Peripersonal space in the psychological neuroscientific literature has been defined by Rizzolatti for the first time as the multisensory body part-centered representation of the surrounding, of the space immediately surrounding the body. This is a very important article from Rizzolati's groups that kind of summarize their discoveries. In the 81, they discovered in the putamen, intraparietal sulcus, and the premotor cortex of the macaque monkeys bimodal neurons. So endowed with this property, they had overlapping visual field, which means that whenever someone touched either the face or the hand, and a visual stimulus occurred either close to the face or close to the hand, the same neurons was activated. So this was considered by Rizzolatti as a kind of encoding of the peripersonal space by those areas of the brain. And now there's unanimous consensus about the plasticity of such a representation that could be modulated by both the use of tools and by social interactions. So now in these studies, I try to see if a musical interaction can modulate the peripersonal space. And there's been a very recent debate, Buffacchi and Yannetti in this article criticized the common view of peripersonal space as a bubble surrounding the body or the body parts, because they say it doesn't do justice to the graded response to multisensory stimuli that has been tested in this field. And they propose to conceive it rather as a gradients, so rather as fields, so not as bubbles, because they say these neurons and the behavioral responses to these stimuli are scaled. So the concept of a bubble, so as an in or out entity, doesn't do justice to this kind of reactions. But I think that we can still conceive these peripersonal spaces around the body and around the part of the body as bubbles endowed with gradients, because however, even gradients has an in or an out part. So about social modulation of peripersonal space, Teneggi was one of the first who tried to see if a modulation of the peripersonal space occurred after an interaction. And first, they found that whenever you face at 1 meter of distance another person compared to a mannequin, your peripersonal space shrink. On the contrary, after a cooperative interaction, it was an economic game. After a cooperative interaction compared to a non-cooperative interaction, this peripersonal space extended toward the other person. How did they measure the peripersonal space? By means of a multisensory integration paradigm. So by means of tactile and auditory stimulus, response to tactile and auditory stimulus. They modulated the sound coming from two loudspeakers beside each of the participants, so on this side and on this side, so that the participant could hear the sound coming from different distances, either coming from the actor to the participants in the other direction, from the participant to the actor. But only the inward direction was affected in showing this effect. So after the cooperative interaction, you can see these distances, the response to the sound coming from these distances was faster, right, than before. Okay, so after a cooperative interaction, there's a faster reaction to this auditory tactile stimulus. The tactile stimulus was given to the hand of the participant, together with the auditory stimulus coming from different distances. Because it is well known that whenever a sound occurs close to the body of a person, it facilitates the tactile response to this stimuli. So they saw that after a cooperative interaction, the extension, so this facilitation occurred also in the extrapersonal space, so in the space close to the partner. So they conclude that high-level social and cognitive representations, like cooperations, are immersed or recoded into the physical and perceptual experiences of the body, thereby providing concrete and rich feelings that facilitate prediction, evaluation, and social behavior. This is a conclusion that is perfectly in keeping with some tenets of the embodied music cognition and musicology, cognitive musicology in general. For example, there is unanimous consensus about the fact that sensory-motor synchronization, interpersonal sensory-motor synchronization, and entrainment is able to induce a feeling of affiliation between or among the participants. Nevertheless, given the intrinsically temporal dimension of music, the spatial dimension of music has been neglected. Music has been aptly called by the Stanayake the temporal art. There are also many other kinds of temporal arts, like performances of any types, theater performances, and dance, of course. But in particular, art, music can be considered the temporal art par excellence. On the other hand, the embodied approach has tried to investigate a bit the space, but in particular the body space. For example, this study tried to see how entrainment, the tempo of the music, can be represented by clouds of points visible by means of motion capture techniques. Probably many of you knows about that. I don't know if are they turned on? Here is movement.
Is it always in the
Okay, so as you can see, you have you can visualize these spaces produced by the gestures. The authors conclude that point cloud is the result of a projection of timing instances onto the peripersonal space, the space that the body occupies during the dance. And nevertheless, I think that here it is not exactly the peripersonal space that is involved, it is body space. Peripersonal space, according to Rizzolatti definition, is the space of reaching objects and of interacting objects. Here there's no interaction in this particular study. So I think that we needed some study about that. Why jazz? Because probably a jazz interaction increased the possibility to collectively produce a result in a cooperative condition compared to a non-cooperative condition, which can, on the contrary, disrupt the collective flow, let's say, and the collective composition. On the other hand, there's some evidence, some neurological evidence that a jazz interaction, jazz playing in the study was not an interaction, it was just playing inside a magnetic resonance scanner, playing just standard. There's some evidence that while these subjects were playing just standards, there was an activation of the default mode region of the brain and a deactivation of the executive control network. The executive control network is the network that is active generally when we interact with the external world. So there's a kind of inward attitude, let's say, in improvising and in playing jazz that could promote flow-like state. So our first hypothesis following Tanegi's study was that a cooperative musical interaction can extend the peripersonal space of the musicians toward the partner. And we measured it in the same way as Tanegi, so by means of a multisensory integration paradigm. There is also evidence that correct harmony, incorrect harmony compared to correct harmony can induce a feeling of pleasantness and activation of the amygdala. That it's fundamental for recording the emotional values of things in general and music in particular. Why I'm talking about harmony? Because we modulated the condition, the cooperative and non-cooperative condition in the following way. We let each musician of the couple play with a partner, which was one of you in this room that now you'll discover, who with this partner playing with the guitar either the correct or the incorrect chords of the jazz standard, which is autumn leaves. Our hypothesis was that after the cooperative interaction, that is, after the correct harmony played by the partner, the peripersonal space would extend toward the partner. Then there was a side issue of this experiment, because using this multisensory paradigm, we found an already published article 2 years ago which shows that musicians are better multisensory integrators. So they are faster in integrating visual, auditory and tactile stimuli. But it was tested in a sample of, comparing musicians and non-musicians, but in a very short distance. It was in 60 centimeters. Here in this experiment, we are using a distance of 120 centimeters between the two musicians. So these were the hypotheses of ours. We had 14 musicians. We had 5 singers, 5 guitars, 3 saxophones, 1 trumpet. with at least 10 years of regular musical training, either formal or informal, and they had also quite a lot of expertise in ensemble music playing. They had to be able to play and improvise on these, at least on these jazz standards, on these. And then we had a sample of 14 non-musicians. Actually, we already had this sample because we, in Turin, there's always, there were already ongoing studies about this paradigm. So with non-musicians, we already had these 14 non-musicians that we could compare to with the sample of 14 musicians. So these were the experimental conditions and tests. On the left, you see on the upper side the cooperative conditions, so the condition with the correct harmony by the partner, the condition of the non-cooperative condition, so with anchored chord by the partner. The anchored chords was like that. There was an up and down and half a tone, each for measure of the tune. And then we had a baseline condition that could be either before the first one or after the second one, in order to avoid learning effects. Of course, we randomized each condition, the cooperative and the non-cooperative conditions, and we do that in different days, just to avoid, again, the learning effect. So we did that in 2 times with at least 2 weeks between the two. But which was the test? The test, as I said, was a multisensory integration test, an audio-tactile integration test. On the right, you can see that we delivered either unimodal stimuli, that is either only auditory and close to the subject, or only auditory and close to the partner, or only tactile on the end of the subject by means of 2 electrodes, and or bimodal stimuli, that is tactile and auditory close to the partner, or tactile and auditory far, so it is close to the, the first one was close to the participant or far from the participants, so close to the partner. And they had to press a button as fast as they could. So they did that task after the experimental condition, the cooperative and the non-cooperative experimental condition, and this was the same task done in the baseline condition. Okay. Then, at the end of both the cooperative and the non-cooperative condition, we let the subject answer a questionnaire with 4 questions. How correct did you find your partner's playing? How much did you enjoy your partner's playing? How similar to you did you find your partner? How much dismay did you feel in playing with your partner? So as for the data analysis, a power analysis to see how big the sample should be, we calculated 2 ratios for the near and the far space by dividing each reaction time to the far and to the close to near sound by the tactile response only, by the only tactile, so by the unimodal response, and putting them in a 2/3 repeated measures ANOVA with stimulus, TA near and TA far, per condition, that is cooperative, non-cooperative, and baseline condition. Then we did t-tests for the questionnaires, so questionnaires either in cooperative, comparing cooperative and non-cooperative condition. Then we try to see if there were correlations between the reaction times and each of the questions. And we did it like that. We subtracted the ratios that you see, the two ratios that you see, in the non-cooperative condition from the same ratios in the cooperative conditions, and then we obtain an index that we correlated with the same difference between cooperative and non-cooperative conditions of the values of the questionnaires. Is that clear? Or we can go back to this if you think. And then we did a mixed ANOVA to see, to compare the reactions of musicians and non-musicians. So we have stimulus, but in this case, the raw reaction times to the tactile auditory near and tactile auditory far as Williams subject factor, and musicians and non-musicians as between subject factors. So here, just to give you two examples, you can listen to and you will tell me if this is a cooperative or non-cooperative condition. I hope it will work.
Betrayed by my window, the autumn leaves of red and gold. I see your lips, the summer kisses, the sunburned hand I used to hold. Since you went away, the days were long, and soon I'll hear all winter song. There is you, my darling, when autumn leaves start to fall.
So was it a cooperative or non-cooperative?
Cooperative.
It was a non-cooperative, but it was cooperative enough. It was, of course, the other, the partner. It was always the partner. But you can see another more traumatic, let's say, reaction.
Poor guy. Can we do it again? I don't want to do this.
Can we hear cooperative?
So, although we're commanded not to stop whatever had happened during the performance, he stopped and complained a lot. So, here are some results. These are the ratios of the reaction times. As you see, in the cooperative condition, we have the same result as in the baseline condition. There is a significant difference between the response to the auditory stimulus in the far space. So there's a different response to the auditory stimulus in the far space and the auditory stimulus in the closed space, meaning that the facilitation effect occurred in occurred for the closed space, for the near space, in the baseline condition and in the cooperative condition, but didn't extend in the far space. Okay? So the reaction times to the auditory stimuli in the far space was longer, was higher than the reaction times to the stimulus in the closed space. So we didn't have this extension of the peripersonal space. Nevertheless, we had an interesting effect, because after the non-cooperative condition, the reaction times in the near space was as late as the reaction times in the far space, meaning that something happened. Then, as for the questionnaires, we saw for 3 questions we saw significant differences, meaning that the conditions had a subjective impact on the performance, and we found a correlation in at least for as regards to question 4, the questions about the dismay produced by the partner. And this correlation shows that the higher was the dismay induced by the partner in the non-cooperative condition, the higher was the reaction time in the far space, in the closed space. So the more rejected, let's say, was the other partner. And as for the comparison between musicians and non-musicians, in the base, we did only in the baseline condition, because of course non-musicians didn't play. We found a general effect of velocity, let's say velocity in the response by the musicians. We had an overall effect of facilitation in the near space if you take all musicians and musicians with the same sample. So we can conclude that that musicians are better multisensory integrators. But as I said, this was a side issue of this study. So even if we didn't find any effect of facilitation after the cooperative condition, so we didn't find an extension, let's say, of the peripersonal space after the cooperative condition, we found another interesting effect of the complementary side of interaction that is generally neglected in the literature, which means lack of facilitation effect after a non-cooperative interaction. How could be interpreted as a near space that becomes far after the non-cooperative interaction, as if the subject would run away from the non-cooperative situation. And I will talk in a moment about how the concept of mutual incorporation that is broken after the non-cooperative interaction can help us interpret these findings. And then the last finding is that the musicians are, is a confirmation that musicians are better multisensory integrators. So I have just some points for the discussion. The first one is why this extension did not occur. Well, probably for 2 reasons. The first one is that we had only 2 sound points, one coming from besides the subject and one coming from besides the partner. So we didn't have a scaled presentation as in Teneggi experiment. This was the first, actually the first part by another Italian psychologist called Andrea Serino, with only 2 points in space, and this is the one that we used. Maybe it's because of that we didn't find any effect. So, Another reason could be that there are, in the literature, different ways of measuring this peripersonal space. There is pencil or laser pointers in the extrapersonal space, and there is simply a statement that people is recommended to give whenever another person enters the peripersonal space. So if I come this direction, the subject has to say, stop, this is the maximum distance I want to be from you. This is another way of measuring peripersonal space. Then the concept of mutual incorporation, that I think it could be useful to interpret these studies from an embodied cognition point of view. Because we know from the literature that using tools extends actually the peripersonal space, as I said at the beginning, kind of incorporating the tools after some minutes of using. They do that with monkeys. It's been done with people, with humans. And De Jager and Fuchs tried to put forward the concept of mutual incorporation. That is, they draw an analogy between tool use and interaction with people. As tools can be incorporated into the body schema, and of course, musical instruments, Luke knows probably, can be incorporated into the music, into the body after very long learning periods. In the same way, the mutual incorporation can occur between two or more coordinating subjects, to a degree depending on the joint action in place. From simply rowing a candle, there has been an experiment by Soliman et al. With two people rowing a candle, sewing a candle together, and after that measuring with another multisensory integration paradigm their body schema, that change as if a joint body schema emerged after this very simple joint action to the complex joint action that are implied by music, dancing, and so on. So there's some other points. For example, we saw that the harmonic dimension in this case counted for the modulation of the peripersonal space, as if the melodic line drawn by the subject was rejected by the harmony played by the partner. This is because also sound, as we know here very well, has a special dimension that would be interesting to test in some way, so using the third dimension of the 3D sound, and also because we can argue that there is also a spatial dimension in the concept of flow. The concept of flow implies one of the issues of the concept of flow is the temporal loss of awareness. But there is some ethnographic evidence that there is also, while playing and while listening to music, an alteration of the space experience. Some people report blending with space after listening or while listening to music. And there's been some attempt to look at a group flow rather than simply an individual flow experience. So this would be another point to develop. And finally, since, as we saw, peripersonal space is a body part central representation, probably it depends. So it depends also on the music instruments that is used. So probably body space, peripersonal space of a drummer which uses picks that already extend their reaching is different from the peripersonal space of a singer that doesn't use any instrument at all, or from very big instruments player, like piano players, like bass player, and so that's why we excluded from our experiment these very big instrument players, like piano players, like double bass players and drummers, but we did include singers. We had 5 singers. Nevertheless, we compared the reaction of these 5 singers to the reaction of the instruments musicians, and we didn't find any difference. But this is another avenue for further exploration that has been suggested already by these people. Okay, so thank you. Here are some collaborators to this experiment in yellow and red. But I'd like to thank also all the other collaborators during these 3.5 years of PhD at EPEN and in Turin. And thank you all.
I have a simple question, actually. So, your results show that the cooperation is not different from the neutral situation, in fact. But if the cooperation is bad, then you see a difference. But could it not be the case that, and I'm referring to our new study on the quality of the interaction, that the cooperation was not good enough?
Yes, I was wondering.
Yes, and so we know as musicians that in order to really have a good cooperation, that we need much more rehearsal in order to get timings correct and so on. So I don't know if you took it actually into the discussion just to say that cooperation might not have been good enough. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering, since you used the jazz, why didn't you use the paradigm of 4/4? In the meaning that both people actually improvise. One plays 4 bars, then the other responds directly to that. And very often you see the direct interaction between the two, so that the second person usually picks up the motive that the first person actually started to develop.
Yeah.
And then you can actually see a very good flow between the musicians, but sometimes you have this situation where the first person starts and the other person doesn't want to pick it up, even it is actually in the good harmony state, but just goes with something else. So then see actually the reaction of the musicians. How would they work?
Even then, there is no guarantee that the interaction is good.
Well,
that's. Yeah.
But I think it would induce a better flow between the musicians, because if the one and the other one starts to work and develop the same motives, and they like the way how they both play, the one picks up from the other, so it's not always because the second. And then once that you see that the one develops it, the other cuts it off always by doing something else. The other one maybe will still try to cooperate, like to try to pick it up, but if the second one constantly, let's say, cuts it off, then you can see, I would say you might see also quite a big dismay and lack of cooperation.
Yeah, there are many manipulations that we can do. For example, we can use free jazz rather than a standard jazz. In the free jazz, probably there's even more space for interaction, because there are no such structure that constrains people.
Alessandro, to go a bit further, the questionnaire afterwards, did it question the quality of the interaction? So one of the 5 questions was that?
Yeah, in some way, yeah.
So in that regard, maybe you could answer the question of Mark. I'm not sure.
Yeah, this question was about the agreeableness, for example. There was a question about the correctness. Very simple question, but I think it is worth to consider this point. Maybe comparing two musicians interacting for the first time and comparing two musicians that are.
For example, was there a question about agency in here? No.
There was no question about agency. No.
I have a fundamental question, I guess. Can you explain a bit what auditory tactile integration has to do with the peripersonal space?
Yeah.
It looks like, for me, as a definition of it, but you use it much wider than just as integration, or not?
You use it?
Much wider. I mean, when you talk about peripersonal space, you talk about social issues and so on. But what has auditory tactile integration to do with it?
Yeah,
Why do you think that is better, or could be better or not? I don't know.
Could be better, or
I mean, why has this integration to do with peripersonal space?
Yes. Oh, is what I said at the beginning, the discovery that we react faster to a tactile stimulus when a close auditory stimulus occurs as well. So you are faster to integrate, meaning that the coding of the space around you is different from the coding of the space which is far from you. So the peripersonal space is is different from the extrapersonal space. At least this is what the neuroscience psychological literature says. But of course there have been a lot of other.
Perhaps just to comment, you can make a distinction between proximal and distal stimuli. And if you have tactile sense, it's coming together. It should be interesting to see kind of transition. This is distal, but when I do this, it's becoming proximal. And tactile, it sits between. And I think if you can extend the proximal stimuli to something which is at more distance, then you have kind of extension of your peripersonal space as well. And another question also is you speak about multisensory, you speak about auditory and tactile, but you have also the kinesthetic sense and the proprioception. And how you could perhaps try to use also EMG and other things. Just a comment.
I think that what I know for sure is that when a fly or a moustique comes close to your ear, immediately that is a very fast reaction time. And also they use it for people asking attention to turn their head in car driving, putting here something. So there is, you get also from these sounds tactile feelings, the chicken things. So there I see that there is some integration, but that is nearly at the sensory level and not at the social interaction.
Yeah.
Well, and I could understand what your new finding, that it breaks down, that you need to know whether it is really tactile or auditory. You have to find out the distinction better. So as a musician, it's not so good to be a better integrator. You have to distinguish it better.
But I think that integration means a better distinction in this case.
Okay.
Yeah. Because yes, if you carry well, the very task is to react in some way. In our case, pressing a button. So if you show that you are faster in integrating those different stimuli in a way, I think that you can say, but probably there are better tasks to do that you distinguish in a better way those stimuli from compared to a non-musician.
But instead of a more social effect and a peripersonal space effect, it could also be an arousal effect. I mean,
it could be what?
An arousal effect.
Arousal.
That you're faster because you're aroused due to the type of interaction that was induced by the experiment.
Yeah.
So I kind of follow Leon.
But you should have the same different conditions then.
Well,
while it's
it
limited
depends on
to-
the effect of the conditions on the arousal of the subject.
No,
Maybe
sorry, I
it's-
mean to all the stimuli. If you were faster for being aroused and there was no contribution of the integration, you should be faster also to just tactile stimuli and to tactile.
Probably, yeah. If it's an
while
arousal
the-
effect, yeah.
mm. While the idea is that one of the three kinds of stimuli should be the critical one in terms of integration. There should be
Yeah,
the
that's
discrimination.
I have a question also about the the distal as well as proximal auditory stimulus is at the same time of the tactile stimulus, right? So the only difference between the two auditory stimuli is the acoustic space, which means that due to the acoustics, some delay lines
left
are
and right.
added actually to the sound. And so my question is actually in other studies, how do you control for this variable, because that depends on the room where you do the experiment and so on. And is there something in the literature about this in the other studies, for example?
I
Because
think
that could
that-
have a big effect. If
Yeah.
you do that in a church, for example.
Yeah.
Can I just, there is also a kind of study for chemical sensory, and then it's with a kind of black box, and it's very fixed. It's the same itself. If you have a smell which is coming from there or there and the distance, it makes also a distinction. But you should.
It's controlled because it's in a
yes.
box.
So it has to be. This is with sensors. It's chemosensors. But the same with sound.
But according to me here, it's not controlled.
No.
And the acoustics is quite bad, I think. It's
It could be better, but I think it's good enough now.
Yeah.
Of course, with this
And
means, but we had a control of that. We did it with the audiometer, so we put the audiometer close to the subject and far from the subject. We didn't do that ourselves for the previous experiments.
The audiometer only measures the decibels, not the spectrum.
But this was also another aspect. You spoke about arousal, and you spoke about harmony, but you also have the loudness. And if you are trying to do something with your amygdala and your startle reflex and so, then also if you have, it was also an electric guitar. So if you have the loudness of the sound, this can be also a critical factor for doing something.
Yeah.
But that was measured with the audiometer.
Yeah.
Not the sound of the guitar. No.
Okay.
The sound of the
It
sound
could be interesting
coming
also
from the
if you
two
should do
loudspeakers.
the same with acoustic guitar and with electronically amplified guitar. Perhaps you could do also a kind of comparison test to see if there is a distinction. I think it could be critical.
That has nothing to do with the test. It has only the cooperation. It could be whatever kind of instrument actually.
I'm sorry if I don't answer your question, your first question about interception, but I have to think about it because it's not that.
But we will meet in class.
Can I also ask the task itself? Was it only done once, the reaction time, or did you do it 3 times, for example, and took an average? So, for example,
There's a lot of trials. No, there's a 60 for after each. We did 2 conditions for the cooperative and 2 conditions for the other one. So we had 60 to 120 stimuli.
So each person, let's say, did the test twice.
Yeah.
And have you compared
after each condition? I mean, after the cooperative condition, then they did it twice, and then the second day they did twice again. So we had a lot of data.
Would there be an interest to see the difference between the first and the second try, for example, to also see, perhaps after the cooperation, this reaction time is more stable compared to the non-cooperative state? Perhaps it won't be that much, but because I also noticed the differences are, for example, 1 second in between And is
No,
there
no, less,
so
less.
no ratio?
100
the
milliseconds
ratio.
or something.
Okay.
These are
Okay. Yeah, but that's
these
what
are
I
the
meant.
ratio.
And for
Yeah.
example, in literature, is there how can I say again, like, how can I say this? In literature, can you also find timing differences when they say that this is I'm talking clinically significant right now, but that the effect is great. You know what I mean? That you could say, for example, the difference between 100 milliseconds is because in reaction time, I think it's quite a lot. I'm not sure if my question is clear.
I'm not sure, but you suggest to compare the reaction after the first trial with the reaction after the second trial in the one of the two conditions?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if
You mean it's the power of the difference? It's a ratio, right? It's not a millisecond.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yeah, this is the ratio that you,
The ratio.
you wasn't.
Okay.
Were you referring to this one?
Yeah, I misunderstood it as milliseconds.
Can I just one more? Thank you. Also, I think.
This will be the last question.
Last question.
No.
And I think the amount of questions prove that this is an interesting subject,
Yes.
because I just want to say thank you for the presentation. I like a lot of the ideas, and there are a lot of, I think, openings to continue research. I think a personal space.
That's what I like.
Because it's so personal for every one of us. I think it's a very interesting subject. I had a couple of things, but one thing that I was thinking also is that in a lot of these experiments, people try to create a sense of flow, which is obviously, especially in an experimental setting, very difficult to create and to be sure that it's there and all this. But I was also thinking that instead of playing music, one may be also making the task very simple, in the sense that also non-musicians, I think, could be able to enter a quality interaction in a simple musical task, like tapping or doing very simple melodies or whatever. Even sometimes maybe the non-musician can get easier in some sense of flow in a thing. It's like more fun or a game. Like, and the other, like instead of playing music, I was also thinking like when I'm listening to music, also I have the feeling my peripersonal space can change. When I'm going out or to a party, sometimes I'm quite amazed that I'm allowing other people that I'm sharing this musical experience with are sometimes so close and it doesn't bother me. It's different than just being in the subway while being close. I can believe that also music in itself, just listening or the experience of music can also induce some effects and not just playing it. So
yeah,
another avenue for maybe some questions.
What I said, because there's an entire book by Margaret, I guess his name is Herbert, called Trance in Everyday Life, and this is where the report of these different perception of the space after listening to music comes from.
Okay.
And as for the first question, there are, for example, already some studies by Keller and Feinhardt who used tapping, so with non-musicians, and they did it while scanning with a magnetic resonance of the brain, finding that at least that their discovery could be interpreted as a kind of activation of the default mode network, inducing a kind of sense of flow when there is an adaptive partner. They did that with a robotic partner. So there was an interaction between a person, a real person, and a virtual partner that could be more or less adaptive. They find that if it was too much adaptive, it wasn't that fluent, the interaction, it wasn't considered that.
Which study was it?
By
There's a study by Keller and Feinhardt.
I think I remember it
5 years ago, so I can give you the reference.
No, and flow with the robot seems a very far-fetched thing, but in a way interesting that there are more quantitative things and studies being done on this. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask one more question? I was just wondering about Matthias' gaze. Was it controlled? But because I saw that he was always he was not making contact.
Not even cooperative.
It was not to laugh. It was
Yeah,
done.
yeah.
I was always serious and not looking.
I'm not looking.
Yeah, not looking.
Yeah, because we recommended people not to talk during the performance